There's a story from Colorado that sounds too ridiculous to be true. Town builders in the 1870s supposedly erected tall false fronts on their buildings for one specific reason: to block the view of the mountains. The idea was that newcomers from the east wouldn't be reminded they'd left civilization behind if they couldn't see those massive peaks looming overhead. Today, a mountain view can add hundreds of thousands of dollars to a property's value. But in the 1870s, merchants thought those same mountains would scare customers away. That story might be folklore, but it reveals something fascinating about false fronts. They weren't just about making buildings look bigger. They were about making the frontier feel less frightening. Here's what most people don't understand about false fronts. They weren't random folk architecture dreamed up by frontier carpenters. They were deliberate attempts to copy a specific style of expensive building popular in eastern cities from the 1850s through the 1880s. That style was called Italianate. Italianate buildings had distinctive characteristics. They were blocky and angular, often taller than they were wide, with flat-topped front facades. If you looked at an Italianate building from the street, you'd see what appeared to be a completely flat roof. But that flat front was actually hiding a gabled roof behind it, pitched at an angle to shed rain and snow. In places with heavy snow loads, that hidden roof had to be steeply pitched, or the building would collapse under the weight. The flat-topped facade wasn't decorative. It was functional. And in eastern cities where commercial districts were built wall-to-wall, this created a continuous roof line that looked impressive and unified. These buildings were made of brick or stone, expensive materials that required skilled masons and significant investment. Western merchants wanted that same impressive look. They wanted their frontier towns to feel established, legitimate, and civilized. But they had three problems. First, they couldn't afford brick or stone construction. Second, they couldn't afford to wait months for skilled masons to complete work. Third, they had no idea if their town would even exist in 5 years. Boom and bust economics ruled the frontier. A gold strike could create a town of 5,000 people in 6 months. When the gold ran out, that same town could be abandoned in half the time. Wood changed everything. With wood frame construction, you could build fast and cheap. More importantly, you could exaggerate. A brick facade that rose 20 feet above the actual roofline would collapse under its own weight without extensive support. But a wooden facade could be as tall as you wanted. It weighed almost nothing and could be braced from behind with simple framing. So Western merchants took the Italianate concept and stretched it. A one-story building with an 8-foot ceiling could sport a facade that made it look like a 2-story structure. The false front rose 15, sometimes 20 feet above the actual roof. From the street, it created the illusion of substance and permanence. From behind, it was obviously fake. This is where the term false front comes from. Original Italianate buildings weren't false at all. Their facades legitimately hid functional roofs designed to manage water and snow. But Western versions exaggerated the concept beyond any structural necessity. They were deliberately deceptive, creating an appearance that didn't match reality. The psychology behind false fronts went deeper than simple vanity. When people arrived in a frontier town after weeks of travel through wilderness, they were looking for signs of civilization and stability. A street lined with proper-looking commercial buildings suggested the town had a future. It suggested businesses were established and trustworthy. It made the frontier feel less like a gamble. For merchants, false fronts were essential marketing. Competition was fierce in boom towns. If your neighbor's store looked more impressive than yours, customers might choose them instead. He who had the best facade got the customers. So every shopkeeper wanted to create an immediate and memorable street presence. Signs got fancy. Ornamentation increased. Paint jobs became more elaborate. The front of the building received all the investment, while the sides and back remained crude and utilitarian. There was also the Eastern immigrant factor. Most people settling the West came from established Eastern cities or European towns. They were used to brick commercial districts, paved streets, and multi-story buildings. Arriving in a frontier town of one-story log cabins and canvas tents could be psychologically jarring. False fronts made these towns feel more familiar. They mimicked the urban environments immigrants had left behind, providing visual comfort in an unfamiliar landscape. That brings us back to the Colorado story about hiding mountains. Whether literally true or not, it captures something real about frontier psychology. The vast western landscape was intimidating. Mountains, endless plains, and huge skies reminded people just how far they were from civilization. Town builders instinctively understood that creating familiar visual environments helped people feel safer and more settled. The irony is almost painful. Today, those same mountain views that supposedly needed hiding are among the most valuable real estate features in America. People pay premiums for properties with mountain vistas. The very thing that might have frightened 1870s settlers is now what attracts millions of tourists and residents to Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming. False fronts also serve practical purposes beyond psychology. In many western towns, commercial buildings were constructed wall-to-wall along main streets. The false fronts created visual continuity, making a collection of hastily built structures look like a unified commercial district. This wasn't just aesthetic. It was civic pride and economic development. Towns competed for railroad routes, county seats, and business investment. A town that looked established and prosperous was more likely to attract these valuable assets. The construction sequence reveals the economic realities. Many boom towns started as tent colonies. Merchants literally operated out of canvas tents stretched over wooden platform floors. As profits accumulated, they'd replace tents with simple wood frame buildings. The false front might be added immediately to the frame structure, or it might come later as the business became more successful. Either way, the facade received better materials and greater ornamentation than the rest of the building. False fronts had a fatal flaw. They burned spectacularly. Western towns consisted primarily of wooden buildings constructed close together along dusty streets. When fire started, it spread fast. Many frontier commercial districts burned completely multiple times. After each fire, town builders faced a choice: rebuild with wood and risk another catastrophe, or invest in more expensive but fire-resistant brick or stone construction. Successful towns usually chose brick for their second-generation commercial buildings. But even then, the false front style persisted. Brick false fronts still rose above the actual roofline, still created that distinctive flat-topped appearance, still mimicked the Italianate style that had inspired the wooden versions. The aesthetics outlasted the practical necessity. The false front commercial building became an icon of the urban pioneer West. Unlike many myths of the West, false fronts truly were everywhere. They appeared in mountain mining towns, plains agricultural communities, and early railroad centers throughout Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, Nevada, and beyond. Today, the surviving false front buildings are cherished. They represent authenticity and history. Towns preserve them carefully, understanding their value for tourism and cultural heritage. The irony is complete. These buildings were literally false, designed to deceive, constructed cheaply as temporary expedients in uncertain boom towns. Yet they've become the most authentic symbol of the American frontier, more recognizable than any other architectural form from that era. The false became real. The temporary became permanent. The cheap imitation became the treasured original. And those mountains that supposedly needed hiding became the most valuable view in the West. That's the paradox of the false front. It was a lie that told the truth about the frontier. Optimistic, ambitious, deceptive, practical, temporary, and somehow more memorable than anything built to last.